The aurora borealis painted the sky in ribbons of green and violet on the night of March 8, 2003, casting an otherworldly glow across the small fishing village of Whitefish Bay, Alaska. Population: 642. Nestled along the Inside Passage, the community clung to the shoreline like barnacles to a ship's hull, its weathered buildings bearing witness to generations of fishermen, loggers, and those seeking refuge at the edge of the world. At 10:23 p.m., the emergency line at the Alaska State Troopers' Whitefish Bay detachment crackled to life. Trooper Angela Blackwood, a 20-year veteran who'd transferred from Anchorage seeking the slower pace of rural Alaska, picked up on the second ring. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Reynolds, and it trembled with an emotion she'd heard too many times before. Raw, unfiltered panic. "She's gone," Marcus gasped, his words tumbling over each other. "I don't understand. The doors were locked. Everything's locked. But she's gone." Trooper Blackwood reached for her notepad, her instincts honed by 2 decades of crisis calls taking over. "Slow down, sir. Who's gone? Start from the beginning." "Jennifer. My girlfriend. Jennifer Nakamura. She went next door maybe an hour ago to return something to Mrs. Chen, and she never came back." The trooper's pen paused over the paper. An hour wasn't long, not really. People got delayed. They lost track of time. But something in Marcus's voice, a quality she couldn't quite name, made her skin prickle. "I'm sending someone to your location." "What's the address?" 47 Salmon Creek Road, the blue house with white trim. "Please hurry. Something's wrong. I can feel it." Trooper Blackwood radioed for backup, then grabbed her parka from the hook by the door. The temperature outside had dropped to 12 degrees, and the wind coming off the water carried the bite of something ancient and merciless. She'd been in Alaska long enough to respect its capacity for swallowing people whole when she arrived at the modest craftsman-style home 15 minutes later. Marcus Reynolds stood in the driveway, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He was 24 years old, rail-thin, with the kind of face that looked permanently worried. He'd been waiting outside despite the cold, unable to remain in the house that had somehow become empty of the person he loved. "Tell me exactly what happened," Blackwood said, following him toward the front entrance. Marcus's story spilled out in fragments. Jennifer Nakamura, 23 years old, graduate student in marine biology at the University of Alaska Southeast, had borrowed a serving dish from their neighbor, Dorothy Chen, earlier that evening. Around 9:40 p.m., Jennifer had decided to return it before the weather turned worse. A storm was rolling in from the Gulf of Alaska, and the marine forecast predicted freezing rain that would make the short walk between their houses treacherous by morning. "I was working on my thesis," Marcus explained, his hands shaking as he unlocked the front door. "She kissed me on the forehead and said she'd be back in 10 minutes. That was almost an hour and a half ago." The interior of the house was neat, almost obsessively so. Jennifer's laptop sat open on the dining table, its screen displaying a research article about salmon migration patterns. A mug of tea, still faintly warm, rested beside it. Her wallet and keys lay on the kitchen counter. Her phone was charging in the bedroom, its screen showing 3 missed calls from Marcus. "I waited 20 minutes before I started to worry," Marcus continued, following Blackwood through the house like a ghost haunting his own life. "Then I went to Mrs. Chen's house. She said Jennifer had left 45 minutes earlier, just walked out the door, and headed home." Blackwood examined the entrances. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. Its deadbolt was engaged when Marcus had returned from the neighbor's house. The back door was secured with both a lock and a chain that could only be fastened from inside. The windows were all latched tight against the Alaskan cold, their frames swollen with moisture and sealed with weather stripping Marcus had installed during the fall. "Show me the route she would have taken," Blackwood instructed. They stepped into the bitter night, Marcus leading her around the side of the house to the narrow footpath that connected his property to Mrs. Chen's. The beam of Blackwood's flashlight swept across the frozen ground, revealing something that made her breath catch. Footprints. Jennifer's distinctive hiking boots, size 7, with a unique tread pattern from her sorrel caribou winter boots, were clearly visible in the fresh dusting of snow that had fallen during the evening. The prints led away from Mrs. Chen's house, crossing the property line and heading toward the Blue Craftsman where Jennifer lived with Marcus. But approximately 20 feet from her own front door, the footprints simply stopped. Not faded, not obscured by wind or subsequent snowfall, they ended as completely as if Jennifer had been plucked from the earth by invisible hands. Trooper Blackwood had seen many strange things during her career in Alaska. Hikers who wandered off trails and were never found. Boats that disappeared in calm seas. Entire camps abandoned with meals still cooking on stoves. But this violated something fundamental about the physical world. People didn't simply vanish mid-stride. She radioed for additional support, requesting K-9 units and every available trooper within 50 miles. Then she turned to Marcus Reynolds, whose face had gone pale in the harsh LED beam of her flashlight. "I need you to think very carefully," she said. Was Jennifer afraid of anyone? Had she mentioned feeling watched or followed? Any unusual phone calls or visitors? Marcus shook his head, but his eyes told a different story. There was something there, some piece of information he was turning over in his mind, weighing whether it mattered. "What is it?" Blackwood pressed. "It's probably nothing," Marcus said slowly. "But about 2 weeks ago, Jennifer mentioned that one of the maintenance guys at the research station had been asking her a lot of questions. Personal questions, she said, about where she lived, what her schedule was like. It made her uncomfortable, but she didn't want to make a big deal about it." "Do you know this person's name?" "No, she just called him the older guy from facilities. Said he was always around, even during hours when he shouldn't be working." Blackwood made a note to follow up on this lead, but her attention remained fixed on the impossible scene before her. The footprints that ended in nothing. The locked house. The complete absence of Jennifer Nakamura from a life she'd clearly been living just hours before. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, awakened by the commotion and the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, emerged from her house wrapped in a thick robe. She was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher who'd moved to Alaska with her late husband in 1978. Her hands trembled as she invited the troopers inside, but her memory was sharp. "Jennifer came by around 9:30, Mrs. Chen explained, settling into her worn recliner while Blackwood took notes. "She returned my casserole dish, the blue ceramic one I'd lent her for a potluck last week. We talked for maybe 15 minutes. Nothing unusual. She seemed happy, actually. Excited about some research data she'd collected. Did she mention feeling worried about anything?" "Anyone?" Mrs. Chen paused, her weathered face creasing with concentration. "No, nothing like that. Although..." She trailed off, her gaze drifting toward the window that overlooked the path between their homes. "What is it, Mrs. Chen?" "It's probably not important, but my nephew was here that evening. Thomas. He'd stopped by to help me with my heating system. It's been making strange noises. He was in the basement when Jennifer arrived, so they didn't really interact, but he came upstairs while we were talking, offered to walk Jennifer home because of the weather." Blackwood's pen froze. "And did he?" "No. Jennifer thanked him, but said it was just a quick walk, no need to trouble anyone." She pulled her coat tight and went out into the night. Mrs. Chen's voice wavered. "That was the last time I saw her." "Your nephew," Blackwood said carefully. "What's his full name?" "Thomas Chen. He works at the Southeast Alaska Marine Research Center. He's in facilities management there. Has been for years. Such a good boy. Always checking on me." The connection struck Blackwood like a physical blow. The maintenance worker Jennifer had mentioned. Mrs. Chen's nephew. The man who'd offered to walk her home. "Is Thomas still here?" Blackwood asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Oh no. He left shortly after Jennifer did. Said he had an early shift tomorrow." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened as she registered the implications of the questions. "You don't think Thomas had anything to do with this? He would never hurt anyone. He's always been so gentle, so helpful." Blackwood maintained her professional composure, but her mind was already racing ahead. She needed to locate Thomas Chen immediately. She needed to search his property, examine his vehicle, and most urgently, she needed to find Jennifer Nakamura before the trail went completely cold. By midnight, the small community of Whitefish Bay had been transformed into a staging ground for what would become one of Alaska's most baffling missing persons investigations. Additional troopers arrived from Juneau and Sitka. Search and rescue volunteers assembled at the fire station Equipped with thermal imaging cameras and GPS devices, the Coast Guard prepared boats to search the nearby coastline in case Jennifer had somehow ended up in the water. But even as the search expanded, Trooper Blackwood couldn't shake the image of those footprints ending in unmarked snow. Somewhere in the space between Mrs. Chen's house and Jennifer Nakamura's home, in a span of less than 50 feet, a young woman had ceased to exist in any trackable way. The aurora continued to dance overhead, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. In Alaska, the land kept its secrets. Dawn broke over Whitefish Bay at 8:47 a.m., painting the sky in shades of steel and ash. Trooper Angela Blackwood hadn't slept. She'd spent the night coordinating search teams, interviewing neighbors, and trying to make sense of evidence that refused to cohere into any logical pattern. Jennifer Nakamura had been missing for 10 hours and 17 minutes. In Alaska, that could mean death. Hypothermia could kill in less than an hour at these temperatures. But the locked doors, the undisturbed house, and those impossible footprints suggested something far more sinister than exposure. Sergeant Ray Kowalski arrived from the Juneau detachment at 7:15 a.m., bringing with him 30 years of experience and a reputation for solving cases that others had abandoned. He was a thick-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years staring at frozen crime scenes. Alaska had been his entire career, and he understood its capacity for cruelty better than most. "Brief me," he said to Blackwood, accepting a cup of coffee from one of the volunteers at the makeshift command center they'd established at the fire station. Blackwood spread crime scene photographs across a folding table, her exhaustion evident in the slight tremor of her hands. 23-year-old female, graduate student at UAS, left neighbor's house at approximately 9:40 p.m. last night. Never made it home, which is roughly a 30-second walk. House was locked from the inside. No signs of struggle. Her footprints in the snow just stop. Kowalski studied the photographs with the intensity of a jeweler examining a suspect diamond. Stop how? Like she was lifted straight up. The prints are clear, well-defined. Then, nothing. No other tracks. No evidence of a vehicle. The wind wasn't strong enough to obscure prints that quickly, and we've got multiple witnesses who confirm the timeline. What about the boyfriend? Marcus Reynolds. He was home working on his graduate thesis. Says he called out for her when she didn't return, then went to the neighbor's house to check. That's when he discovered Jennifer had left almost an hour earlier. His story's consistent, and we've got no evidence of relationship problems. Kowalski lit a cigarette, ignoring the no-smoking signs that papered the firehouse walls. There's always a boyfriend or a husband. Statistical probability demands we look there first. I know the statistics, Sergeant, but we've also got a maintenance worker at the research center who'd been showing unusual interest in the victim. And this maintenance worker happens to be the nephew of the neighbor Jennifer visited. He was at his aunt's house the night Jennifer disappeared, offered to walk her home. That got Kowalski's attention. Name? Thomas Chen, 46 years old. Been working at the Marine Research Center for 12 years. Lives alone about 3 miles outside town. We sent troopers to his residence at 3 a.m., but he wasn't home. His supervisor says he called in sick this morning. First time in 5 years he's missed work without prior notice. Kowalski crushed his cigarette under his boot. Then, Thomas Chen just became our primary person of interest. I want his property searched, his vehicle located, and his financial records pulled. And I want to know everywhere he's been in the last 72 hours. The search for Thomas Chen consumed the investigation's first critical hours. His small cabin, located on a wooded lot overlooking Aki Bay, sat empty when troopers arrived with a search warrant at 9:30 a.m. The interior was meticulously organized, almost obsessively so. Tools hung on pegboards in the garage, labeled and arranged by size. The kitchen was spotless, with canned goods lined up in perfect rows. The bedroom held a single twin bed, its corners made with military precision. But it was the basement that sent cold fingers of dread up Blackwood's spine when she descended the narrow stairs. The space had been converted into a workshop, its concrete walls lined with photographs, not family pictures or vacation snapshots, but images of women, young women. All of them appeared to be in their 20s, all of them dark-haired, all of them photographed candidly, walking to their cars, sitting in coffee shops, entering buildings. The photographs were organized chronologically, stretching back years, and in the most recent section, filling an entire wall, were pictures of Jennifer Nakamura, Jennifer at the research station, Jennifer at the grocery store, Jennifer and Marcus walking together along the waterfront, Jennifer through her own window, unaware she was being watched. The collection represented months, possibly years, of surveillance. Jesus Christ, Trooper Wallace muttered, standing beside Blackwood as they documented the disturbing gallery. This isn't about a random attack. This is obsession. Blackwood's hands were steady as she photographed the evidence, but her mind reeled. Thomas Chen hadn't just shown casual interest in Jennifer. He'd been stalking her, documenting her life. Waiting for what? An opportunity? The right moment? The most chilling discovery came in a locked filing cabinet that required bolt cutters to open. Inside were notebooks filled with handwritten entries, a journal that read like fever dreams, mixed with meticulous planning. Thomas had documented Jennifer's schedule, her routes, her habits. He'd written about his feelings, rambling passages that oscillated between worship and rage. One entry, dated 3 days before Jennifer's disappearance, read, "She smiled at me today in the hallway. Finally, sees me. Finally, understands. Soon we'll be together properly. Away from the boy who doesn't deserve her. Away from everyone." The final entry, written the morning of March 8th, contained just 4 words. Tonight. Everything changes tonight. While the forensic team processed Thomas Chen's cabin, Sergeant Kowalski focused on reconstructing Jennifer's final day. Her movements had been routine, almost mundane. She'd attended 2 classes at the university, spent 3 hours analyzing data in the research lab, and returned home by 6 p.m. Marcus confirmed they'd had dinner together, leftover chili that Jennifer had made the previous night. She'd been relaxed, happy, talking about plans for spring break. The casserole dish that prompted her visit to Mrs. Chen had been sitting on their counter for days. Marcus couldn't explain why Jennifer had suddenly decided that evening to return it, especially with bad weather approaching. It seemed arbitrary, the kind of minor household task that could have been postponed indefinitely, unless someone had encouraged her to make that trip. Blackwood interviewed Mrs. Chen again, this time pressing harder on details about Thomas's presence that evening. The elderly woman was defensive at first, unwilling to believe her nephew capable of harm, but under careful questioning, fissures appeared in her certainty. "Thomas called me that afternoon," Mrs. Chen admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He asked if Jennifer had returned my dish yet. I thought it was odd at the time. How did he even know I'd lent it to her? But Thomas always seemed to know everything happening in the neighborhood. I figured he'd overheard me mention it." "What did you tell him?" "I said no, that I'd probably just get it back, whenever." Thomas suggested I might call Jennifer to remind her, since the weather was supposed to turn bad. He said it would be a shame if the roads got icy and she couldn't make it over safely for days. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "I called Jennifer that afternoon, mentioned it would be nice to get the dish back if she had a chance. She said she'd bring it by after dinner." The pieces were assembling into a horrifying picture. Thomas hadn't acted on impulse. He'd engineered the opportunity, manipulating his aunt into creating the circumstances that would place Jennifer outside, vulnerable, at a specific time when he could intercept her. But interception didn't explain the impossible disappearance. It didn't explain the locked house or the footprints that ended nothing. At 2:15 p.m., a trooper monitoring Thomas Chen's financial records made a discovery that redirected the entire investigation. 3 days before Jennifer's disappearance, Thomas had rented a storage unit at Mendenhall Valley Self-Storage, 20 miles north of Whitefish Bay. He'd paid for 6 months in advance, in cash, and had specified that he didn't want the facility to have a key to his unit. Sergeant Kowalski ordered an immediate search. He and Blackwood made the drive in silence, both of them preparing for what they might find. Storage units were where guilty people hid evidence. They were where victims' belongings ended up. Sometimes, they were where victims ended up. The facility's manager, a nervous man named Eddie Pruitt, led them to Unit 247. Mr. Chen was real particular about his privacy, Eddie explained, fumbling with the master lock. Came by at odd hours, always alone. Last time I saw him was yesterday evening, around 8 o'clock. He was loading something into his truck. Could you see what he was loading? Blackwood asked. Not clearly. It was dark, and I didn't want to seem nosy. Looked like maybe a rolled-up carpet, something heavy. He was struggling with it. The storage unit door rolled up with a metallic screech. Inside, the space was mostly empty, except for a few boxes and, in the far corner, a commercial freezer, the industrial kind used in restaurants, large enough to hold a quarter of beef. Kowalski approached it slowly, his hand resting on his service weapon. Blackwood found herself holding her breath, praying and dreading in equal measure. The freezer's lid lifted with resistance, cold air billowing out. Inside, wrapped in layers of heavy plastic sheeting, was something human-sized. But it wasn't Jennifer Nakamura. The body had been in the freezer long enough that identification would require dental records or DNA analysis. What they could determine immediately was that this victim was female, appeared to be in her 20s, and had been dead for significantly longer than the hours since Jennifer's disappearance. We need forensics here now, Kowalski said, his voice tight. And we need to find Thomas Chen before he kills again. Because that's what this was, Blackwood realized with sickening clarity. Not an isolated incident. Not a crime of passion or opportunity gone wrong. Thomas Chen was a serial predator who'd been operating undetected for years in this small Alaskan community, hiding behind his helpful facade while collecting victims like trophies. And somewhere in the frozen wilderness, Jennifer Nakamura was either his latest victim or, if they could find her in time, his next survivor. The discovery of a body in Thomas Chen's storage unit transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a manhunt. By 4 p.m. on March 9th, every law enforcement agency in southeast Alaska had been alerted. Roadblocks were established on the handful of highways that connected the region. The Coast Guard deployed boats to monitor the waterways. Bush pilots were briefed to watch for suspicious activity on remote islands and logging roads. But Alaska's vastness worked in Thomas Chen's favor. The Tongass National Forest stretched across 17 million acres of wilderness, containing thousands of places where someone could disappear. The region's intricate maze of islands, channels, and inlets provided countless routes for someone with a boat, and Thomas Chen, as facilities manager at a marine research station, had unrestricted access to vessels. Sergeant Kowalski assembled his team at the trooper station in Juneau, converting a conference room into a war room plastered with maps, photographs, and timelines. Jennifer Nakamura's picture occupied the center of the largest board, her smile bright and hopeful in the image her mother had provided. Around her, Kowalski had arranged everything they knew about Thomas Chen, his work history, his properties, his known associates. We're treating this as a time-critical rescue operation, Kowalski announced to the assembled troopers and volunteers. Jennifer Nakamura has been missing for 20 hours. Given the circumstances and the evidence we've found, we have to assume she's being held against her will. Our primary objective is to locate her alive. Dr. Patricia Winters, a forensic pathologist who'd flown in from Anchorage, had preliminary findings on the body from the storage unit. Female, early 20s, approximately 5'4". Cause of death appears to be ligature strangulation. Time of death is estimated at 6 to 8 months ago, though the freezing complicates decomposition timelines. We're running dental records against missing persons reports, but this is going to take time. 6 to 8 months, Blackwood repeated, her mind calculating. That means Thomas killed someone last summer. We should cross-reference missing persons from that period. Trooper Wallace had already begun that search. I've got 3 possibilities. Sarah Patterson, 21, reported missing from Ketchikan in July. Hannah Mitchell, 24, last seen in Sitka in August, and Maria Santos, 23, disappeared from Petersburg in September. All of them were young women, all dark-haired, all last seen alone in the evening. The pattern was unmistakable. Thomas Chen hadn't just fixated on Jennifer. He'd been hunting throughout the region, targeting women who fit a specific profile, taking advantage of Alaska's vast distances and the ease with which people could vanish without immediate alarm. "We need to coordinate with those communities," Kowalski ordered. "Get their case files, compare evidence, see if Thomas Chen's name appears anywhere in their investigations. And I want to know if he had any reason to be in those towns during the relevant time periods." The research center's personnel records provided disturbing answers. Thomas Chen's position required him to travel occasionally for equipment maintenance and facility inspections at satellite research stations throughout southeast Alaska. His travel log showed visits to Ketchikan in July, Sitka in August, and Petersburg in September. Always alone. Always for legitimate work purposes. Always with access to company vehicles and lodging. He'd been hiding in plain sight, using his job as cover for a killing spree that had gone unnoticed because the victims came from different jurisdictions and no one had connected the disappearances. While the investigative team worked to identify the body and connect Thomas to previous crimes, search teams focused on finding Jennifer. Every property Thomas had access to was being systematically searched. His cabin had been processed top to bottom, revealing evidence of meticulous planning, but no indication of where he might have taken his latest victim. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Karen Wu, one of Thomas's coworkers at the research station, contacted troopers with information she'd initially dismissed as irrelevant. Thomas had recently requested access to the facility's retired infrastructure, specifically an old pump station that had been decommissioned 5 years earlier when the center upgraded its water systems. "The old pump house sits on the northern edge of our property," Karen explained to Blackwood. "It's basically abandoned now. Thomas said he needed to do a final safety inspection before we sealed it up permanently, but that was 3 months ago, and he never filed the inspection report." "Where exactly is this pump house?" "About 2 miles up Waidelich Creek, accessible only by trail or boat. It's isolated, completely out of sight from the main facility. We used to have a caretaker living there back in the 80s, so there's actually a small apartment attached to the pump house itself." Blackwood felt her pulse quicken. Isolated, out of sight, equipped with living quarters. It was perfect for someone who wanted to keep a victim hidden. Sergeant Kowalski authorized an immediate response. 6 troopers, including Blackwood, prepared to make the approach. They would go in quietly, on foot, to avoid alerting Thomas if he was there. The terrain was treacherous, a narrow trail that wound through old-growth forest, climbing steadily up a valley carved by glacial meltwater. They departed at 5:30 p.m., just as darkness was settling over southeast Alaska. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees, and snow had begun falling in thick, heavy flakes that muffled sound and reduced visibility. Blackwood's breath formed clouds that hung in the still air. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind through the spruce trees set her nerves jangling. The pump house materialized from the gloom like something from a nightmare. It was a squat concrete structure covered in moss and decay, its metal door rusted and hanging slightly ajar. A single window on the attached apartment showed the faint flicker of lamplight from within. Someone was there. Kowalski signaled for the team to spread out, surrounding the building. Blackwood took position near the main entrance, her service weapon drawn, her heart hammering so hard she was certain Thomas could hear it through the walls. The plan was simple. Announce their presence. Give Thomas one chance to surrender. If he refused or showed any sign of harming Jennifer, they'd breach immediately. But before Kowalski could issue the command, a scream tore through the night, raw, terrified, unmistakably human. "Go! Go! Go!" Kowalski shouted, and Blackwood was moving, her training taking over, her body operating on muscle memory and adrenaline. The door crashed inward under the combined force of 2 troopers using a battering ram. Blackwood was through the opening immediately, weapon up, scanning for threats. The interior of the pump house was a nightmare of shadows and flickering light. Old machinery loomed like mechanical monsters. Pipes ran along walls and across the ceiling in incomprehensible patterns. And in the corner, chained to a support beam, was Jennifer Nakamura. She was alive, bruised, terrified, shaking with cold and shock, but alive. "Jennifer," Blackwood shouted, rushing toward her. "You're safe now. We've got you." But Jennifer wasn't looking at Blackwood. She was staring past her, toward the doorway that led to the apartment section, her eyes wide with terror. Blackwood spun, raising her weapon, but she was too slow. Thomas Chen emerged from the darkness with the kind of calm that suggested he'd been expecting this moment. He was smaller than Blackwood had imagined, maybe 5'8", thin, with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like someone's gentle uncle, not a serial killer who'd stalked women across hundreds of miles of wilderness. In his right hand, he held a hunting knife with an 8-inch blade. "Don't," Blackwood warned, her weapon trained on his center mass. "Drop the knife, Thomas. This doesn't have to end badly." Thomas smiled, and Blackwood saw then what Jennifer must have seen: the emptiness behind his eyes, the absence of anything human or reachable. "It already ended badly," he said quietly. "It ended badly years ago." He moved with startling speed, lunging not toward Jennifer, but toward Blackwood herself, the knife arcing upward in a killing stroke. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Thomas Chen collapsed, the knife clattering across the concrete floor. He lay still, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes already glazing over. Sergeant Kowalski stood in the doorway, his service weapon still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. "Suspect down," he said into his radio, his voice flat and professional. "We need medical assistance immediately, and get those chains off the victim." Blackwood holstered her weapon with shaking hands and returned to Jennifer, working to free her from the chains that had held her captive for nearly 24 hours. Jennifer collapsed into her arms, sobbing, her body racked with tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. "You're safe," Blackwood repeated, over and over, as much to convince herself as Jennifer. "You're going home. You're safe now." But even as she said it, Blackwood knew that Jennifer would never truly be safe again. Not in the way she'd been before Thomas Chen decided she was his. The physical chains were coming off, but the psychological ones would take years to break. EMTs arrived within minutes, rushing Jennifer onto a stretcher and beginning treatment for hypothermia and dehydration. Marcus Reynolds, who'd been waiting at the command center, broke through police lines when he heard Jennifer had been found, running to the ambulance and climbing inside to ride with her to the hospital. Thomas Chen was declared dead at the scene. The knife he'd wielded was bagged as evidence, though the outcome of the confrontation wasn't in doubt. Sergeant Kowalski's shooting would be ruled justified by any review board, but as the adrenaline faded and exhaustion set in, Blackwood found herself standing outside the pump house, staring at the wilderness that stretched in all directions. They'd found Jennifer. They'd stopped Thomas. But how many others had they been too late to save? The body in the storage unit was just the beginning. The investigation was far from over. The search of Thomas Chen's properties would take weeks and reveal horrors that haunted investigators for years afterward. What had begun as a missing persons case had transformed into one of Alaska's most extensive serial killer investigations, involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions across the entire southeast region. The body recovered from the storage unit was identified through dental records as Sarah Patterson, the 21-year-old who disappeared from Ketchikan the previous July. She'd been a seasonal worker at a salmon cannery, living alone in a small apartment near the waterfront. According to her family, Sarah had been planning to return to college in Seattle at the end of the summer. Instead, she'd encountered Thomas Chen during one of his work trips to maintain equipment at a Ketchikan research facility. The coroner's report made for grim reading. Sarah had been held captive for several days before her death, restrained with zip ties that left permanent marks on her wrists and ankles. Cause of death was ligature strangulation, but she'd suffered numerous other injuries consistent with torture and sexual assault. Thomas had kept her alive long enough to terrorize her, then disposed of her body in a way that would preserve the evidence of his crime, like a trophy. The discovery prompted expanded searches of all locations Thomas had access to. The old pump house where Jennifer had been held was thoroughly processed, revealing evidence of previous occupants. DNA samples recovered from the apartment section matched two other missing women, Hannah Mitchell from Sitka and Maria Santos from Petersburg. But their bodies weren't found at the pump house. Thomas had used the location as a temporary holding cell, bringing his victims there for days or weeks before moving them elsewhere. The question that consumed investigators was simple and terrible. Where were the others? Sergeant Kowalski brought in specialized search teams with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. They began systematic searches of the vast forested land surrounding Thomas Chen's properties, working outward in expanding circles from known locations. The terrain was brutal, steep slopes, thick underbrush, and areas so remote that searchers had to be helicoptered in and out each day. The first body was discovered on March 15th, 1 week after Jennifer's rescue. A cadaver dog alerted near a creek bed about half a mile from Thomas's cabin. Excavation revealed the remains of Hannah Mitchell, who'd been missing since August. She was buried in a shallow grave, wrapped in heavy plastic, her body preserved by the cold Alaskan ground. Like Sarah Patterson, Hannah showed evidence of prolonged captivity and torture before death. The discoveries continued with heartbreaking regularity. Maria Santos was found 3 days later, buried in a similar manner near an old logging road that Thomas would have passed regularly on his way to work. Each victim had been treated the same way: held captive, terrorized, murdered, and buried in isolated locations where they might have remained undiscovered indefinitely, if not for Jennifer's survival, leading investigators to Thomas. But the forensic evidence suggested there were more victims than the 3 confirmed deaths. Items recovered from Thomas's cabin included jewelry, driver's licenses, and personal effects that belonged to women who didn't match any known missing persons reports. Some of the items dated back years, suggesting Thomas's killing spree had begun long before investigators had suspected. The scope of the investigation expanded to include historical missing persons cases throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Detective James Morrison from the Anchorage Police Department joined the task force, bringing with him files on unsolved disappearances stretching back 15 years. Cross-referencing Thomas Chen's travel records with missing persons reports revealed a disturbing pattern. Thomas had worked at various research facilities throughout Alaska before settling at the Southeast Marine Research Center. During his employment at a facility in Kodiak from 1995 to 1998, 3 women had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. During his time at a laboratory in Homer from 1999 to 2001, 2 more women had vanished. In each case, the women were young, dark-haired, and last seen alone in the evening. The task force began the grim work of exhuming old cases and searching properties near Thomas's previous residences. Each location told the same story: a seemingly helpful maintenance worker who kept to himself, who volunteered for late shifts and remote assignments, who knew the infrastructure better than anyone, and used that knowledge to identify perfect hunting grounds. Dr. Patricia Winters, the forensic pathologist, worked around the clock analyzing remains and evidence. Her preliminary assessment suggested Thomas Chen had killed at least 8 women over a 15-year period, possibly more. The pattern was consistent. He targeted vulnerable women living alone, stalked them until he understood their routines, then struck when they were isolated and defenseless. What we're seeing is a highly organized offender, Dr. Winters explained during a task force briefing. He planned meticulously, maintained control over his victims for extended periods, and disposed of bodies in ways designed to avoid detection. The freezer where we found Sarah Patterson wasn't just about preservation, it was about control. He could keep his victims even after death, visit them whenever he wanted. Trooper Angela Blackwood, who'd become the public face of the investigation, found herself struggling with the psychological weight of each new discovery. She joined law enforcement to help people, to make communities safer. Instead, she'd uncovered evidence that a predator had been operating freely for years, taking victims from small towns that trusted each other and believed themselves safe. The community response was a mixture of horror, disbelief, and anger. Town hall meetings in Whitefish Bay, Ketchikan, Sitka, and Petersburg drew hundreds of residents demanding answers. How had Thomas Chen gone undetected for so long? Why hadn't law enforcement connected the disappearances earlier? What failures in the system had allowed him to claim so many victims? Mrs. Dorothy Chen, Thomas's aunt, was hospitalized with stress-related complications after learning the full extent of her nephew's crimes. She'd provided him with alibis, welcomed him into her home, trusted him completely. The revelation that he'd used their relationship to engineer Jennifer's abduction shattered her. She gave a tearful statement to investigators, revealing details about Thomas's childhood that painted a disturbing picture of early warning signs that had been ignored or misinterpreted. Thomas had been a quiet child, she explained, but not in a shy way, in an absent way, as if he was watching the world from behind glass. He'd shown unusual interest in dead animals, spending hours examining roadkill and insects. His parents, Dorothy's brother and sister-in-law, had dismissed these behaviors as scientific curiosity. After all, Thomas was intelligent, did well in school, and never caused trouble. As a teenager, Thomas had been caught breaking into a neighbor's home, though no charges were filed. He claimed he'd been checking on their cat while they were away, though the neighbors hadn't asked him to do so, and later discovered several items had been moved. Small things, photographs, clothing, personal effects. Nothing taken, just touched, examined, violated in some fundamental way. "We should have seen it," Mrs. Chen sobbed to Blackwood during one interview. "All the signs were there, but he was family. We wanted to believe the best." The most chilling revelation came when investigators examined Thomas's computer and personal journals. He'd kept meticulous records of his crimes, documenting each victim in disturbing detail. The journals revealed a man who viewed himself as an artist, his crimes as performances that only he fully understood. He'd developed elaborate fantasies about each woman, constructing imaginary relationships before ultimately destroying the objects of his obsession. One journal entry, written after Sarah Patterson's death, read, "They never understand what I'm offering them. The chance to be perfect, preserved, mine forever. They fight and scream and ruin everything." But S understood at the end. In those final moments, she saw me, really saw me. That's what I'm looking for. That recognition. The psychological profile that emerged painted Thomas Chen as a sexual sadist with narcissistic personality traits and possible psychopathic tendencies. He'd been driven by a need for control and a complete inability to empathize with his victim's suffering. The women weren't people to him. They were objects to be collected, studied, and ultimately destroyed when they failed to fulfill fantasies he'd created. Jennifer Nakamura's survival became a crucial element in understanding Thomas's methodology. During extensive interviews conducted after her physical recovery, Jennifer provided details that helped investigators reconstruct the timeline of her abduction and clarify how Thomas had pulled off the seemingly impossible disappearance. "He was waiting outside Mrs. Chen's house," Jennifer explained, her voice steady, but her hands trembling as she spoke. "When I left, he offered to walk me home, said the weather was getting bad, and his aunt would worry if she knew I'd gone alone. It seemed reasonable. He was her nephew, someone I'd seen around, someone who worked at the research center. I trusted him." The walk between the houses took less than a minute, but halfway there, Thomas had grabbed her from behind, covering her mouth with a chloroformed cloth. Jennifer's memories of the next hours were fragmentary, being carried, the sound of an engine, the sensation of cold concrete when she woke up chained in the pump house. "But what about the footprints?" Blackwood asked. "Your tracks ended in the middle of the yard. How did he manage that?" Jennifer's answer was simultaneously simple and horrifying. "He'd prepared the scene earlier in the day. He told me this while I was captive. He wanted me to understand how clever he'd been. He'd walked the path from Mrs. Chen's house toward mine, wearing boots similar to mine, creating a trail that would be found later. Then he'd carefully brushed away his own tracks, leading back, using a branch to disturb the snow in a way that looked like wind patterns. It was a magician's trick, fundamentally simple, once explained. Thomas had created the illusion of an impossible disappearance to buy himself time and misdirect the investigation. He'd counted on investigators being baffled by the apparent impossibility, wasting crucial hours trying to understand how Jennifer could have vanished rather than searching for where she'd been taken. He said other disappearances were easier, Jennifer continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He said I was special, that he'd planned this one for months, that he wanted to create something the police would never solve. He wanted me to understand that no one would find us, that we could be together forever in the pump house. The psychological impact on Jennifer would take years to process. Marcus Reynolds, who'd stood by her throughout the ordeal, eventually revealed to investigators that Jennifer had night terrors, couldn't be in enclosed spaces without panicking, and struggled with survivor's guilt, knowing that other women hadn't escaped Thomas's clutches. By April 2003, 2 months after Jennifer's rescue, the task force had confirmed 8 victims and was investigating connections to 6 additional unsolved disappearances. The case had generated national media attention, with news crews descending on southeast Alaska to cover what had become one of the region's most extensive serial killer investigations. The families of the confirmed victims, Sarah Patterson, Hannah Mitchell, Maria Santos, and 5 others, struggled with the aftermath of revelation. Some found closure in knowing what had happened to their loved ones. A state commission was formed to review law enforcement procedures and identify systemic failures that had enabled Thomas's killing spree. The investigation revealed uncomfortable truths about resource allocation in rural Alaska, the challenges of coordinating investigations across vast distances, and the tendency to view missing persons cases as runaways or accidents rather than potential homicides. The hard truth is that Thomas Chen exploited every weakness in our system, Sergeant Kowalski testified before the commission. He used Alaska's geography, its sparse population, and the independence of different jurisdictions to avoid detection. He targeted vulnerable women who he knew wouldn't be immediately reported missing or whose disappearances could be explained away as voluntary departures or accidents. And he was patient, sometimes waiting years between kills to avoid establishing a pattern. The Commission's final report, released in November 2003, made dozens of recommendations for improving missing persons investigations, enhancing communication between jurisdictions, and providing better resources for rural law enforcement. It was cold comfort to the families of Thomas Chen's victims, but it represented a commitment to preventing similar tragedies. The search for additional victims continued into 2004, with specialized teams examining locations throughout Alaska where Thomas had lived or worked. Each property yielded evidence, personal effects, burial sites, documentation of stalking. The final victim count reached 12 confirmed deaths, with strong circumstantial evidence linking Thomas to at least 4 additional unsolved disappearances. Thomas Chen's death during the confrontation at the pump house meant he would never face trial, never be forced to answer for his crimes in a courtroom. Some viewed this as a form of justice, a predator eliminated permanently, unable to hurt anyone else. Others, particularly the victims' families, felt cheated of the opportunity to confront him, to demand explanations, to see him held accountable in the formal structures of law and punishment. For Trooper Angela Blackwood, the case became a defining moment in her career. She'd been the first responder to Marcus Reynolds' desperate call, had followed the evidence that led to Thomas Chen, and had been present when Jennifer was rescued. The investigation consumed 18 months of her life, but it resulted in justice for 12 families who'd been waiting years for answers. She thought often about those footprints that ended in unmarked snow, the impossible disappearance that had launched the investigation. In retrospect, the impossibility should have been a clue that they were dealing with someone who understood crime scene investigation, who planned meticulously, who treated murder as a performance requiring careful staging. The real mystery wasn't how Jennifer disappeared. It was how Thomas Chen had hidden in plain sight for 15 years, collecting victims across Alaska while maintaining his facade as a helpful, reliable maintenance worker. That was the truly impossible feat, the complete compartmentalization of a monstrous interior life behind a mask of normalcy. The Nakamura case, as it became known in law enforcement circles, transformed Alaska's approach to investigating missing persons. The Alaska State Troopers established a specialized cold case unit in 2004, dedicated to reviewing unsolved disappearances and identifying patterns that might indicate serial predators. The unit's first task was re-examining every missing persons case from the previous 20 years, looking for connections that had been missed. Jennifer Nakamura returned to graduate school in the fall of 2003, determined not to let Thomas Chen's crimes define her future. It was an act of extraordinary courage. She completed her marine biology degree and eventually accepted a position with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, though she requested assignment to the Atlantic coast rather than returning to Alaska. The landscape that had once represented freedom and adventure now carried too many dark associations. She and Marcus Reynolds married in 2005 in a small ceremony attended only by immediate family. They chose not to speak publicly about the case, declining interview requests from journalists and documentary filmmakers. Their focus was on building a life that looked forward rather than backward, though both of them knew that Thomas Chen's shadow would never completely fade. Mrs. Dorothy Chen never fully recovered from the revelation of her nephew's crimes. She'd spent years defending him, providing him with alibis, welcoming him into her home and her life. The guilt of having inadvertently enabled his killing spree destroyed something fundamental in her. She moved to an assisted living facility in Juneau, where she spent her final years estranged from most of her family. She passed away in 2007, and her obituary made no mention of Thomas. It was as if the family had collectively decided to erase him from their history, though that erasure came too late for the 12 women whose lives he'd stolen. The families of Thomas's victims formed a support group that met monthly in Juneau. They shared grief, anger, and the peculiar trauma of learning that someone they'd loved had suffered unimaginably before death. Some families found solace in religious faith. Others channeled their pain into advocacy work, pushing for legislative changes that would improve missing persons investigations and provide better resources for families of victims. Sarah Patterson's mother, Linda Patterson, became a particularly vocal advocate. She testified before the Alaska State Legislature in support of bills requiring faster response to missing persons reports and mandating coordination between jurisdictions when disappearances shared common characteristics. Her advocacy helped pass the Patterson-Mitchell Act in 2006, which established protocols for investigating potential serial crimes and provided funding for a statewide database of missing persons. Sarah's death has to mean something, Linda told lawmakers during her testimony. If we can prevent even one family from experiencing what we've gone through, then maybe we can find some purpose in this nightmare. The Southeast Alaska Marine Research Center, where Thomas Chen had worked for 12 years, underwent a comprehensive security review. Investigators discovered that Thomas's position had given him virtually unlimited access to facilities, vehicles, and equipment with minimal oversight. The center implemented new policies requiring background checks for all employees, regular security audits, and protocols for tracking employee movements and vehicle usage. Several of Thomas's former coworkers struggled with guilt over missing warning signs. Karen Wu, who'd provided the crucial tip about the old pump house, left the research center in 2004, unable to continue working in an environment where a serial killer had operated undetected for over a decade. She'd worked alongside Thomas for 7 years, considered him a friend, and never suspected the darkness he carried. He was so normal, Karen told investigators during one of many interviews. That's what haunts me. There was nothing obviously wrong. He never seemed angry or aggressive. He was just there, helpful and quiet and utterly unremarkable. How do you protect against that? The question echoed through the investigation and its aftermath. Thomas Chen hadn't fit the stereotypical profile of a serial killer. He wasn't a drifter or a loner with obvious psychological problems. He'd maintained steady employment, participated in community events, and built relationships with people who genuinely liked him. His crimes were compartmentalized so completely that even those who knew him best never suspected. Dr. Patricia Winters, the forensic pathologist, published a paper in 2005 analyzing the Nakamura case and its implications for understanding serial offenders. She argued that popular culture's portrayal of serial killers as obvious monsters who stood out from society was dangerously misleading. Many serial predators, she noted, were skilled at blending in, at presenting faces that society found acceptable while concealing their true natures. Thomas Chen's greatest weapon wasn't physical strength or criminal sophistication, Dr. Winters wrote. It was normalcy. He understood that being helpful, reliable, and unremarkable made him invisible. People trusted him because he seemed trustworthy, and he exploited that trust with devastating effectiveness. Sergeant Ray Kowalski retired from the Alaska State Troopers in 2010, after 37 years of service. The Nakamura case was the last major investigation of his career, and by his own admission, the one that affected him most profoundly. He'd solved murders, tracked down fugitives, and confronted violent criminals throughout decades of law enforcement work. But Thomas Chen, quiet, methodical Thomas Chen, represented something that troubled Kowalski in ways more dramatic crimes didn't. I keep thinking about all the times he probably passed me in the hallway at the courthouse or the grocery store, Kowalski reflected during his retirement interview. All the times we might have nodded hello, two people going about their business, and I never knew. None of us knew. That's the part that stays with you. The realization that monsters don't announce themselves. They walk among us, wearing human faces, until something finally exposes what's underneath. Trooper Angela Blackwood remained with the Alaska State Troopers, eventually rising to the rank of sergeant herself. She specialized in missing persons investigations, bringing to each case the lessons learned from Jennifer Nakamura's disappearance. She developed training programs for rural law enforcement agencies, teaching techniques for recognizing patterns that might indicate serial predation and emphasizing the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously from the very first moment. Every missing person is someone's Jennifer, Blackwood told trainees. They're someone's daughter, mother, sister, friend. They deserve our best effort, our full attention, our refusal to give up. And sometimes, if we're lucky and we work hard enough, we get them back alive. The old pump house where Jennifer had been held was demolished in 2004. The Southeast Alaska Marine Research Center wanted no physical reminder of the crimes Thomas Chen had committed using their facilities and property. The site was cleared, replanted with native vegetation, and marked only by a small memorial plaque listing the names of his known victims. Families sometimes visited the location to leave flowers or simply stand in silence, honoring the women who hadn't survived. The psychological impact on law enforcement personnel who worked the case was significant. Several investigators sought counseling for trauma related to the disturbing evidence they'd processed and the victims' suffering they'd documented. The Alaska State Troopers expanded their employee assistance programs in response, recognizing that exposure to extreme violence took a toll even on experienced professionals. Detective James Morrison, who joined the task force from Anchorage, took an extended leave of absence in 2004 after the investigation concluded. He'd spent months examining Thomas Chen's journals and evidence, immersing himself in the psychology of a serial killer. The work had been necessary, but corrosive, leaving him with nightmares and intrusive thoughts that required professional treatment to manage. You can't spend that much time inside a killer's mind without it changing you, Morrison admitted during a law enforcement conference in 2006, where he spoke about the psychological costs of investigating serial crimes. You start seeing predators everywhere. You question your own judgment about people. You wonder who else might be hiding in plain sight, wearing a friendly face while planning terrible things. The media coverage of the Nakamura case gradually faded as new stories demanded public attention. But for those directly affected, the survivors, the families, the investigators, the case remained a permanent presence. It was the thing that divided their lives into before and after, the moment when their understanding of the world fundamentally shifted. For Jennifer Nakamura, now Jennifer Reynolds, the passage of time brought healing, but never complete recovery. She gave birth to a daughter in 2008, a joyful event shadowed by fierce protective instincts born from her own trauma. She monitored her daughter's whereabouts constantly, installed security systems that would have seemed paranoid to most parents, and struggled with anxiety whenever her child was out of sight. "I know it's not rational," Jennifer confided to her therapist. "Thomas Chen is dead. He can't hurt anyone anymore. But I also know now that there are others like him out there. Other men who seem normal and helpful and trustworthy until they're not. How do I protect my daughter from something that doesn't announce itself?" It was a question without satisfactory answers, one that parents have grappled with since humans first began telling each other cautionary tales about monsters wearing human faces. The Nakamura case entered law enforcement textbooks as a case study in serial killer behavior, crime scene staging, and the importance of interjurisdictional cooperation. Criminology students studied Thomas Chen's journals, analyzed his victim selection process, and debated the psychological factors that created such a predator. The case became educational material, its horrors transformed into lessons that might prevent future tragedies. But for those who lived through it, the case was never just material for academic study. It was lived experience, the terror of being hunted, the grief of loss, the exhaustion of investigation, the relief of rescue, and the long, difficult work of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by violence. 20 years after Jennifer's abduction, Alaska had changed in ways both visible and subtle. The Patterson-Mitchell Act had created infrastructure for investigating missing persons that didn't exist in 2003. Law enforcement agencies had learned to recognize patterns and coordinate across jurisdictions. The public was more aware that danger could come from unexpected sources, that trust should be tempered with vigilance. But Alaska remained vast, remote, and capable of swallowing secrets. The wilderness still stretched beyond human comprehension, full of places where evidence could hide forever. And somewhere in that wilderness, investigators knew there were probably other victims they'd never found, women who'd encountered Thomas Chen during his 15-year killing spree and whose families still waited for answers that might never come. The case files remained open, technically, though active investigation had ceased. Every few years, someone would contact the Alaska State Troopers with a tip about a missing woman who might have been Thomas Chen's victim. Each tip was followed up, each possibility investigated. Most led nowhere, but occasionally they resulted in recovery of remains that could finally be returned to families who'd spent years wondering. In 2015, construction workers excavating for a new building in Kodiak discovered human remains buried in a wooded area near Thomas's former residence. DNA analysis confirmed the victim as Rebecca Walsh, a 22-year-old who disappeared in 1997 and had never been connected to Thomas Chen's known crimes. The discovery brought closure to her family, but also reopened questions about how many other victims might still be undiscovered. "We may never know the full extent of what Thomas Chen did," Trooper Blackwood acknowledged during a press conference announcing Rebecca Walsh's identification. "What we do know is that he stole at least 13 lives, destroyed countless more, and exploited vulnerabilities in our systems that we've worked hard to address. The women he killed deserved better. They deserve to be found sooner, to be protected better, to live the lives he stole from them." In 2023, 20 years after Jennifer Nakamura's rescue, the Alaska State Troopers organized a symposium on serial crime investigation. Law enforcement personnel from across North America gathered in Juneau to share case studies, discuss best practices, and learn from investigations that had succeeded or failed. The Nakamura case was featured prominently, both as a success story, Jennifer's survival and Thomas Chen's identification, and as a cautionary tale about the dangers of dismissing disappearances as isolated incidents. Angela Blackwood, now retired but still consulting on cold cases, delivered the keynote address. She was 62 years old, her hair silver, but her eyes still sharp with the intensity that had driven her investigation 2 decades earlier. She spoke about the night Marcus Reynolds called for help, about those impossible footprints ending in snow, about the decision to look beyond the obvious and consider possibilities that seemed far-fetched. "Investigation requires imagination," Blackwood told the assembled officers. "Not wild speculation, but the willingness to consider explanations that don't immediately present themselves." Thomas Chen counted on us being logical, practical, focused on what seemed most likely. He staged an impossible disappearance specifically to misdirect us, to waste our time trying to solve a mystery that didn't actually exist. The real mystery wasn't how Jennifer vanished. It was who had the knowledge, opportunity, and motivation to make it look impossible. Jennifer Reynolds attended the symposium, making one of her rare public appearances related to the case. She'd agreed to speak on a panel about victim advocacy and the long-term impacts of violent crime. Her testimony was powerful and painful, delivered in a steady voice that occasionally wavered, but never broke. "I'm grateful to be alive," Jennifer said. "I'm grateful for the investigators who found me, for the people who supported me through recovery, for the family I've built in the years since. But I also carry Thomas Chen with me every single day. He's in every locked door I check twice, every shadow that makes me jump, every moment when my daughter is 5 minutes late coming home, and I immediately imagine the worst." Survival isn't the end of the story. It's just a different chapter.